Good evening, Lighthouse friends. This is the last lesson in our study of Joseph. This is the Lighthouse lesson for May 13th, 2020. Thank you for taking time to listen. We're going to jump right into this. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I tend to, when I get into storytelling mode, I tend to talk too much, and I don't want to do that. I want to help you get the sense of what this story is teaching us, and hopefully you will learn how to apply it to your own life. I watch the statistics that YouTube gives us on videos, and what YouTube tells me is that most people don't like to watch videos that are more than 7 to 10 minutes long, and so I really want to try to stick to that time limit. If you've not been watching, if you haven't paid attention to the beginning of the story, please go back and listen to the earlier lessons. It will help you understand where we're at now. Joseph, that's the man that we've been talking about. He's now a little bit over 30 years old, and he's about to face his past. We read in Genesis chapter 41, in verses 46 through 57. It says, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Then it goes on down in verse 53. It says, the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. That's in reference to a dream that Pharaoh had had, that Joseph had interpreted for him. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food, and then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouse and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in the world. Wow. So much I could say right there, but I want to stick to my notes. Again, here we see the dream coming true. Pharaoh had this dream, had no idea what it meant, had heard that Joseph knew how to interpret dreams, and Joseph did. And if you pay attention to the whole story of Joseph and what happened to him, his brothers had plotted to kill him, sold him as a slave. He was accused of an attempted affair with a leader's wife. He was thrown in jail. Just crazy stuff happened to Joseph. I want you to notice that Joseph didn't plan, didn't scheme, didn't try to find his own way to make the dreams that he'd had when he was 17 come true. As a reminder, Joseph had had these dreams back prior to all of this, that his family was going to bow down to him. And he didn't struggle with that all of his life. He didn't wonder, how am I going to make this happen? He didn't wrestle with what God wanted him to do. He just lived. He just did the best that he could to honor God through his life and through his choices. And still, God brought about his will, which included Joseph. Joseph didn't need to make it happen. Many folks struggle with this idea of what is God's will for my life and how do I figure out what God wants me to do. And I want to encourage you with this story from Joseph that God doesn't need you to figure out some grand scheme. He doesn't need you to put all the pieces together. He needs you to surrender your life to him. That's his will for your life. He wants you to learn what the Bible has to say. These are the instructions that he gave us. He wants you to allow this to change your thinking. And the promise is that if we do that, then we'll know what to do. In fact, Romans 12, it says, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will know what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So the promise that we have is that if we pursue God, if we make honoring him our goal, our mission, and knowing his word, allowing it to transform our minds, the promise is we'll know what to do. And that's the story of Joseph. So let's get back to it. So there in Genesis, here we're now in Genesis 42, and Joseph's father, Jacob, who Joseph hasn't seen or heard from in at least 13 years, learns that there's a grain shortage. Actually, the family knows there's a grain shortage. They're dealing with the famine, but they learn that there's grain available in Egypt. So he sends his sons to buy grain for the family. Well, actually, he sends all but one, because it turns out that Joseph had a younger full brother. So from the same wife that Jacob had Joseph with, he had a younger son named Benjamin. And Jacob remembered that what had happened the last time he'd sent the youngest boy out with the older boys. The youngest was so-called killed, wasn't really killed, as we know from the story. And so he said, there's no way I'm sending Benjamin with you guys. So go to Egypt, get grain, and bring it back. We read that in Genesis chapter 42, verses 6 and 7. It says, now Joseph was governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Wow. This is the beginning of 3 chapters of a convoluted, just honestly, some parts that are confusing story of Joseph wrestling with what to do with his brothers. You see, even though Joseph was a God-fearing, God-honoring man, he was also human. And he remembered the last time that he'd seen these guys, when they had plotted to kill him and then sold him. Now his dream was coming true, that they would bow down to him, and we see him wrestling and struggling with how to resolve all of this. And it seems even for a while, if you read the story in Genesis 43 and the rest of 42, 43, and 44, that he's playing mind games with them, almost just to get back at them for the pain they'd caused him. I honestly don't know what all of this story means, this part of it, other than Joseph had deep family issues that he'd never resolved. And now he was faced with them. His brothers are before him, and it's a wrestling match in his soul. His family had caused him major harm, changed the course of his life, and he's trying to figure out what to do about it. Now, the truth is, when you read this story, the whole story of Joseph, there's no evidence that Joseph was living as an angry, bitter man, having been soured by just the badness in his life. But pain and wounds, they don't just go away. And that unresolved pain was still there, and he was wrestling with what to do about it. So let's read on and see what happens. In Genesis chapter 45, here's what it says. Finally, Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." Now, this was not like after an hour. This was after days and weeks and probably even months of he put one of his brothers in jail, sent the others back, tried to really force them to bring back that younger brother Benjamin. And so a lot of time had gone by where Joseph is keeping the secret. They still don't know that he's alive. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Wow. The story continues on. After that, because Pharaoh had heard about this, Pharaoh tells Joseph, "Hey, if these are your family, then they're my family. We're going to treat them well." Joseph brings the whole family to Egypt. They get houses and land, and eventually Joseph's father dies. And in Genesis chapter 50, the brothers are fearful now. They knew Joseph's loyalty to his father and to his youngest brother, Benjamin, but the brothers still aren't sure where Joseph is with regards to them. And so in Genesis 50, verse 15, we read this. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong things that we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly." His brothers came. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, and here's what I want you to hear, friends. "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" This is Joseph speaking to his brothers who were begging, pleading for forgiveness. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Wow. You know, what Joseph just did is such a core principle of the life that Jesus called us to. This idea of being able to forgive and trust God, that he is able to weave our lives and orchestrate things in this world in a way to accomplish his will, to use the things that are intended for evil, the bad things, the terrible things, eventually for good. I know that is true in my life. I can say with total sincerity, the things you've heard me talk about, some of the really bad stuff that happened to me as a child, outside of my family, things that happened to me in school and things that happened to me, some just very unfortunate things that happened to me, abuse. I can honestly say I'm not holding anything unresolved towards those people, because now the Lord has enabled me to use those things to encourage and help and defend many of you. It reminds me, in fact, I want to turn to it. I read to you or quoted to you earlier from Romans 12, and I want to end tonight with a passage from Romans 12 that talks to us about what to do when evil is done against us. Here Joseph had incredible evil, almost murdered, and this is part of life, unfortunately. This is a cursed world, and it's full of people, you and me, who sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, do things to harm others. And there's some instruction that God gave us for what to do. We find it in Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 17. It says this, and it's tough stuff, but this stuff works. "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay," says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. To end, I would challenge you to think through people you know maybe that have done things to you or you've had some conflict with. I love to use the side of the road test or the grocery store test. I like to imagine running into people at the grocery store and asking myself sincerely, would I want to run and hide? Hopefully they don't see me as I hold up a box of cereal and hide my face, or do I go to another aisle? Or can I sincerely see them approaching and smile and be kind? Or can I see them stranded on the side of the road needing help, and with sincerity in my heart, can I pull over and say, hey, can I help? When you can do those things, you're putting that from Romans 12 into practice. Thank you for listening. I hope you all have a good rest of your week.